The moment you start asking who every nation owes money to, you begin to realize how strange the modern world really is. We are told that debt is dangerous, that borrowing too much is irresponsible, that someday the bill will come due. And yet, the entire planet is built on borrowing. The richest nations are the most indebted. The most powerful governments owe the most money. And somehow, the global system doesn't collapse. It expands. Every year, more debt is created, not less. This alone should tell us something important. National debt does not work like personal debt. A country is not a household. A government is not a credit card user. And money itself is not what most people think it is. When a government needs money, it does not go to a bank and apply for a loan the way you would. It does not wait until it has savings. Instead, it creates a promise. That promise is called a government bond. A bond is nothing more than an IOU, a legal agreement that says, lend me money today, and I will pay you back later with interest. These bonds are sold into financial markets, where they are bought by institutions that want something safe, predictable, and backed by power. Banks buy them. Pension funds buy them. Insurance companies buy them. Investment funds buy them. And in many cases, the country's own central bank buys them too. This is the first illusion that needs to be broken. Governments do not borrow because they are desperate. They borrow because the system is designed for them to borrow. Government bonds are not treated as risky debt. They are treated as assets, sometimes the safest assets in the entire financial system. Entire retirement systems depend on them. Entire banking regulations are built around them. In other words, if governments stopped issuing debt, the modern financial world would break. Now, here's where things get uncomfortable. When people hear that a country owes trillions of dollars, they imagine a lender waiting patiently for repayment. They imagine some giant vault somewhere, filled with money that belongs to someone else. But in reality, most national debt is owed internally. Countries owe money largely to their own financial systems, their own institutions, and indirectly, their own citizens. Your pension fund likely holds government bonds. Your bank likely holds government bonds. Your insurance policy is probably backed by government bonds. So when a government owes money, it is often owing money to the system that keeps society running. This is why the popular idea that one country owns another because of debt is misleading. When people say that one nation owns another nation's debt, what they usually mean is that foreign institutions hold a portion of that debt. But this does not translate into ownership or control in the way people imagine. Debt ownership is fragmented, spread across thousands of institutions, constantly traded, rolled over, and refinanced. The real power does not come from owning the debt. It comes from controlling the system that makes debt essential. To understand that system, we have to talk about money creation. Most people believe money comes from governments printing it. In reality, most money is created by banks through lending. When a bank issues a loan, it does not take existing money from somewhere else. It creates new money digitally. This means debt and money are born together. Every dollar created is matched by a dollar of debt. This is not a side effect. It is the design. Governments sit at the top of this system. Their debt is the foundation upon which private debt is built. Government bonds are used as collateral. They stabilize currencies. They anchor interest rates. And because governments are considered permanent entities, unlike companies or individuals, their debt is assumed to be endlessly rollable. This means old debt is rarely paid off. It is replaced with new debt. When a bond matures, the government issues a new bond to pay the old one. The debt continues, but the system remains calm because nothing breaks. This leads to the second major illusion, that national debt must eventually be paid back in full. In practice, this almost never happens. Governments do not aim to eliminate debt. They aim to manage it. As long as the economy grows, as long as trust remains, And as long as inflation does not spiral out of control, the debt can expand indefinitely. This is why politicians can promise spending without immediate consequences. The cost is not felt today, it is pushed forward in time. And this is where the real question emerges. If debt is never meant to be paid off, who ultimately carries it? The answer is not institutions. Institutions pass the burden along. The answer is future taxpayers. Debt is a claim on future production. It is a way of spending tomorrow's labor today. When a government borrows, it is not stealing from another country. It is borrowing from its own future population. This is why inflation matters. Inflation is not just rising prices. It is a mechanism that silently reduces the real value of debt. When prices rise and wages lag behind, debt becomes easier to repay in nominal terms. The borrower benefits. The saver loses. Governments understand this. Moderate inflation is not an accident. It is a pressure valve. Too much inflation destroys trust. Too little inflation makes debt heavier. The balance is delicate, and central banks exist to manage that balance. Central banks are often misunderstood as government departments. In reality, they operate at arm's length, managing money supply, interest rates, and financial stability. One of their most powerful tools is the ability to buy government debt. When a central bank buys government bonds, it injects newly created money into the system. This does not come from taxpayers, it comes from monetary expansion. This is why people say money is created out of thin air. Technically, it is created against assets, government promises. This arrangement creates a strange loop. Governments issue debt. Central banks buy that debt. Banks use that debt as collateral to create more money. And the cycle continues. The system does not require repayment in the traditional sense. It requires confidence. As long as people believe the system will continue tomorrow, it does. But what happens when that confidence cracks? History shows us that the danger is not debt itself, but loss of trust. When people stop believing a currency will hold value, they rush to escape it. Prices rise rapidly. Savings evaporate. Social order weakens. This is why governments will do almost anything to preserve confidence in their debt. Not because repayment is imminent, but because belief is everything. So when we ask, who is global debt owed to? The honest answer is unsettling. It is owed to no single entity and to everyone at the same time. It is owed to systems, institutions, expectations, and future generations. Debt is not a moral failure of governments. It is the operating system of the modern world. And this brings us to the most important realization of all. Debt is power. Whoever controls the rules of debt controls the pace of economies, the outcomes of crises, and the limits of political action. Understanding this is not about fear, it is about clarity. Because once you see that debt is permanent, you stop waiting for a day when it will all be paid back. And you start asking a better question. Who decides how the burden is distributed? The moment you understand that debt is permanent, a new and more uncomfortable question appears. If governments never plan to fully repay what they owe, and if the system depends on rolling debt forward forever, then what actually happens when a country can't keep the game going? Not in theory, not in textbooks, but in real life. Because history shows us something important. Countries don't collapse when they run out of money. They collapse when trust disappears. Trust is the invisible currency holding everything together. A government bond has value because people believe the government will exist tomorrow. A currency has value because people believe others will accept it tomorrow. Debt survives not because it is manageable, but because it is believable. The moment belief breaks, the entire structure begins to shake. This is why default is not just a financial event. It is a psychological one. When a country struggles to pay its debt, the problem is rarely the size of the debt itself. It is the speed at which that debt grows compared to the economy. As long as a nation's economy grows faster than its debt, the burden feels lighter over time. But when growth slows, interest keeps ticking. Governments then face impossible choices: raise taxes, cut services, print money, or borrow even more. None of these options are painless. Each one shifts pressure onto the population in a different way. Raising taxes angers voters. Cutting services weakens social stability. Printing money risks inflation. Borrowing more delays the pain, but magnifies it later. So governments usually choose the option that feels least visible in the short term. This is where inflation quietly enters the story again. Inflation is often described as a failure, but from the perspective of debt, it is a release valve. It reduces the real value of what is owed without officially defaulting. This is why inflation hurts savers more than borrowers. It punishes those who hold cash and rewards those who owe money. Governments are the biggest borrowers of all. When inflation rises, the debt remains the same in numbers, but smaller in real terms. This is not an accident. It is a feature of the system. A politically painful default can be avoided by an economically painful inflation instead. But inflation cannot be allowed to spiral. Once people expect prices to rise uncontrollably, trust collapses. People rush to convert money into goods, foreign currency, or assets. This creates shortages, chaos, and instability. At that point, debt stops being manageable and starts becoming explosive. This is why central banks walk a tightrope. Too little inflation and debt becomes crushing. Too much inflation and the system loses credibility. Now consider what happens globally. Every major economy is linked. Currencies trade against each other. Debt flows across borders. A crisis in one country rarely stays contained. Investors move money instantly. Confidence evaporates faster than it can be restored. This is why governments are often rescued, not because they deserve it, but because letting them fall would threaten the entire system. Bailouts are not acts of kindness. They are acts of self-preservation. This leads us to one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern economics: moral hazard. Financial systems become more fragile as debt piles up. The safety net meant to prevent disaster slowly encourages it. And yet, removing the safety net would cause immediate collapse. The system is trapped by its own design. At this point, it becomes clear that debt is no longer about money. It is about power and control. Debt determines which countries can spend freely and which must obey conditions. It determines which governments can survive crises and which must submit to external pressure. When a country becomes too weak to borrow cheaply, lenders begin to demand changes. Budget reforms. When a government loses control over its borrowing costs, it loses control over its policy choices. It becomes reactive instead of sovereign. Decisions are made not for long-term development, but for short-term survival. Public services shrink. Inequality grows. Social tension rises. The debt itself may have started as numbers on a balance sheet, but its consequences are painfully real. And yet, even in these moments, the debt rarely disappears. It is restructured, extended, renegotiated, or transferred. Losses are socialized. Pain is distributed downward. The system absorbs the shock and continues. This is why global debt keeps rising decade after decade. Crises do not reduce it, they accelerate it. Each collapse justifies more borrowing, more intervention, more control. At this stage, we can finally answer the question honestly. If every nation is in debt, who is it owed to? Not a secret group, not a single country, not a hidden master. The debt is owed to the system itself, a system that requires growth to survive, borrowing to function, and belief to endure. It is owed to institutions that manage expectations, enforce rules, and decide who gets relief and who absorbs pain. But beneath all of that, there is a deeper truth. Debt is ultimately owed to the future. Every promise assumes that tomorrow's society will be productive enough to honor yesterday's decisions. This is the quiet contract that underpins the modern world. This is why debt is never framed as optional. Children are born into it, workers inherit it, governments change, but obligations remain. The system does not ask consent, it assumes continuity. And as long as economies grow, populations expand, and technology advances, the illusion holds. The future keeps paying the past. So when people ask whether global debt will ever be paid off, the honest answer is no. Not because it can't be, but because it isn't supposed to be. Paying it off would drain the system of the very assets it depends on. It would collapse credit markets, pensions, banking regulations, and monetary policy. The world is not waiting for debt to end. It is built to carry it forever. The real question, then, is not who the debt is owed to. The real question is who decides how the burden is shared, who absorbs inflation. These decisions define power in the modern age more than borders or armies ever could. And once you see this clearly, money stops looking neutral, debt stops looking temporary, and the world starts to look less like a collection of independent nations and more like a single system, balanced precariously on promises about a future that hasn't arrived yet. That is the real story behind global debt. Not numbers, not trillions, but belief, power, and time itself. And this brings us to the most important realization of all. Debt is power. Whoever controls the rules of debt controls the pace of economies, the outcomes of crises, and the limits of political action. Understanding this is not about fear. It is about clarity. Because once you see that debt is permanent, you stop waiting for a day when it will all be paid back. And you start asking a better question. Who decides how the burden is distributed? The